We've heard a lot about three very different topics there: entrepreneurialism, energy, and the role of institutions. And we've got quite a long time for a proper session here of questions. So I want to go to the audience straight away, actually, because I know that you'll be burning to ask things to our speakers. So what I'll try and do is take questions in twos and threes and then conduct discussion around each of them on stage. So who'd like to kick us off? Yes, gentleman at the front, and then a guy in the second row.
I just have a few questions. One is related to the African economy. I'm interested to know where the money coming from in terms of investing. Have you seen Chinese money flowing in more than European investors being attracted to Africa? And one for the energy subject is, how do you see the Internet of Things impacting on this interconnected market of energy in the future? Because those people at Intel tend to believe that everything will be connected and that will help to liberalize the market. Thank you.
My question is largely to the first speaker, but it touches on what Philip was talking about. I was just going to ask, have you ever came across any good examples in Africa of people trying to overcome these weak and corrupt public institutions?
Okay, so there's two questions there really directed to you, Christian, I think. So the first is, where is investment coming from in Africa? Is it particular countries, particular sort of industries? And do you have examples really of entrepreneurs being able to get around the sorts of corrupt institutions that Philip outlined?
So getting access to money is actually one of the biggest problems that entrepreneurs typically have. In Kenya, for example, which is actually one of the best run economies, you would expect to pay around 20% interest on a loan, and that is if you get one. Many of the small entrepreneurs don't even have a bank account. Now, there's several different ways of how they actually get around that problem. The most typical one is family and friends, that you go to somebody who maybe has migrated to the West, and when you see the biggest money flows that go to countries in Africa are typically remittances, so somebody who works out here sends back some money to family, and that sort of generates then some entrepreneurial activity. Another way that this is sort of becoming slightly more formalized, they have a lot of these sort of saving circles where people, maybe around the church or so, or a tight-knit community, they put in money every month, and every month somebody else gets the combined amount. So they have maybe 20 members there, everyone puts in $50, and then there will be 1 month where you get the entire money in one go, and then you can do something that you have money to invest. Now, if you go up sort of the next step from slightly bigger entrepreneurs, one of the things that I found in some research that I do is that they run different type of businesses in order to get money to finance their core business. I'll give you a concrete example. Somebody I talked to who has as his main business, he has a hotel. But the problem is, how do you expand that hotel? You need lots of investment to kind of put an additional floor on top of the hotel. And to go to the bank is A, sometimes very difficult, and B, very expensive. Now, what he does, he has a different business, in his case agricultural, fairly large, where twice a year he has a big harvest, and the money that he generates from that he can then use to literally put a floor on top of the hotel. Many other people use property, that sort of thing. Now, the sort of next step up there would be that you get actually investors to come in. And I noticed there is more and more of this happening. Particularly, some of you might have heard of M-Pesa. Anybody, can I see some hands who have heard of M-Pesa? Not many, okay. You guys should have heard about this, So this is the world's best functioning mobile payment system. Super exciting area across the world. The one country where it really works is Kenya. It's SMS based. Everyone who has a mobile phone basically has an M-Pesa account as well, and you send money via that system. I think about 2/3 of the GDP actually flows through that system, and the transaction volume is larger than the combined transaction volume of all the banks in Kenya. Now, because this generated a lot of excitement also from Western investors, investors, their eyes is going there. Yeah? And you have a phenomenon like Silicon Savannah and something similar in Lagos, where also Western investors are starting to flock to these places and looking for businesses, sometimes through incubators, to put big money on that. Yeah? So things are becoming better and better, I guess, in finance than they are, but they're not easy. That kind of addresses the first question. And maybe the other guys want to say something, and I come back to the second one.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way. So, Philip, the second question was really about ways in which entrepreneurs try to sort of get around the problems associated with these poor institutions.
Well, Christian just mentioned a lot of ways. I mean, there are, as I said at the end, extraordinarily entrepreneurial, many African countries, and there are also very high levels of societal trust, which is one of the ways in which the African people, and of course not all poor people live in Africa by a long way. In fact, the majority of the world's, almost the majority of the world's poor people live in India and Brazil combined. And I think actually this very high level of trust with that sort of ground level, if you like, in society bodes very well for Africa, because if you get the institutions right, together with the rather good demographics that Africa has, combined with this high level of trust in society, I think that suggests to me that if you take a sort of 200-year view, Africa could quite easily be the richest continent on Earth. And a lot of the ways in which African people do get around these problems make use of this high level of societal trust. So many of you will have come across microfinance. And microfinance, often people say, oh, is microfinance the future? No, it isn't the future, I hope. Microfinance is an incredibly ingenious way of getting around desperately problematical institutions in poor countries, using the high degree of trust which exists within communities. So mobile phones is another example, the way in which small traders are able to use mobile phones to compare prices rather than being at the mercy of what become very often in dysfunctional countries monopsonistic purchasers of primary products. Perhaps I can just comment on the funding and the China issue, because I think somebody mentioned China specifically. This does worry me, and economists are not very good at thinking about these kinds of geopolitical issues. But the IEA recently produced a publication on so-called big player theory, the idea that a large institution, very often a state or a state bureaucracy or regulator, but not necessarily so. It could be a very large monopoly firm, can kind of disrupt an economic system, because instead of getting the normal processes of innovation and entrepreneurial development and so on, entrepreneurs are instead trying to think and guess how that big player will behave, because that big player is so important in economic life. And I worry that on a global scale, and certainly on an African scale, that China may become that big player. And economists are not very good at considering these sort of geopolitical considerations and what might happen when sort of economics and politics sort of clashes together in the way things always do when the Chinese government gets involved.
So just before I go to Lynne on the other question then, does China worry, and China's role in Africa worry you, Christian?
Worry would be the wrong word, yeah. When I talk to people there, they see it extremely positive, yeah. They come, they invest, and they put much less strings around it, yeah, so to speak, yeah. Now, the argument always from the West is, yeah, they don't care about corruption, yeah. Now, what I hear from my friends down there is, well, in reality, it's no different what companies from the West do as well, yeah. It's just that they try to hide it in nice consulting contracts, yeah, or so, yeah. But I'm not necessarily worried about it. No, I think the view is a positive one. The one area which might be one concern is that quite often when they do big road projects also, that they also bring the workers from China, yeah, and that's not good for the economy, yeah. As long as they employ locals, nothing wrong with it, yeah.
Yeah. Well, perhaps we'll get on to later some questions from the floor on the role of international institutions in development as well, because that's obviously.
I want to have one more response to the corruption question, yeah. it's much less of a problem than it used to be. Yeah? That's what I hear again and again. Yeah? That maybe 20 years ago you had much more demand for bribes than you have, and a lot of people, they refuse to pay bribes, and then that's it. Yeah, in the end, then also those who demand care less about it. Yeah, it's not that the problem goes away entirely, but it's a slightly less big issue than it used to be. People also get around by choosing where they have activities. Yeah, I find a lot with entrepreneurs, rather than growing one business big and spreading across the country, they start to have several businesses, but in an area where they know all the different players. Yeah, and they have less of a demand than for bribing their way through, so to speak, because here they are somebody who's known and respected in that area.
And Lynne, going to the specific question from the gentleman at the front, but also sort of attached onto that, I mean, what have been the impediments to the sort of introduction of more networked technologies in these poorer countries? Is it a case of geography or poverty or the sort of institutional stuff that Philip was talking about?
I suspect a lot of it is institutional, and that what we've seen from the explosion of cellular telephony and the internet in Africa, I mean, that's a great example of this question of technology leapfrogging, right? Because they never had widespread wired telephony, and then the proliferation of cellular telephony has unleashed all of these entrepreneurial capabilities. And this I think ties directly to the Internet of Things, which is one of my current favorite topics, because for those of you who aren't hip to the lingo, the Internet of Things is the idea that we all have all of these devices, whether it's you have a Fitbit that can calculate how many steps you take per day, and you upload your data and you keep track of all of your fitness through your devices, or all of the myriad other things that we all do with our devices. Combine that with having that same kind of communication capability in the appliances in your home, in your car, and then ultimately moving towards, as you talked about yesterday, driverless vehicles. All of the potential communication capabilities and the connections across all of these ways that we use technology will have a lot of implications. And obviously, they use electricity, so they're energy using. But I think in the grander scheme of things, it's the production and the the learning more about how we actually use energy on a daily basis. So if I asked you, how many cents per kilowatt hour do you pay for your electric bill, I suspect that I might be the only person in this room that knows the answer to that question, because this is the industry I study, right? This is not a set of transactions where we have had a lot of incentive to pay attention, because at some level regulation stands in for and it means that we don't have to pay attention as much to the prices we're paying. But it also means that we don't have as many incentives for innovation and coming up with new ideas. And I think the technology leapfrogging in telephony is an interesting comparison. And one thing that when we think about the idea of technology leapfrogging in energy in developing countries is a very hot topic in energy right now. And it's one that I think there's some similarities with some of the energy and environment technology policy stuff that goes on in the UK and the US and the EU, which is that with an eye towards climate change and trying to implement decarbonization technologies, there's a lot of government activity that's focused on subsidizing particular technologies. So subsidize solar or subsidize wind, onshore wind, offshore wind. And so it's all very technology focused. And similarly, within the sort of development economics and aid, development aid in particular, there's an argument, some folks make an argument for going in and saying, well, why don't we just go into poor rural communities and build a bunch of solar installations, and that way they'll have solar power and they won't have to cook over open fires within their houses, and they'll be healthier and they'll have this energy. And and I'm sure June would be able to speak to this if she were here, but I'm also going to channel my inner Bill Easterly and suggest that the experience of technology-specific and project-specific focuses in development is that they're very misguided and they tend not to work. And so even something down to where you have development NGOs going into rural communities and building wells so that everyone can have more potable water. And, what happens when the well mechanism breaks and you don't have folks there who have the knowledge or the experience to be able to fix it? And so there's, rural community upon rural community in Africa that have water wells that aren't working within, 5 years after they've been installed. And that's a risk that we run if we do a technology focus on something like just going into poor communities and building solar panels. And so I think having a more widespread, distributed, let's have institutions that enable experimentation is more likely to lead to enrichment than just doing these projects.
Well, I'm pleased you knew what the Internet of Things meant, because I certainly didn't. So I was hoping that you'd pick that up on the question. I wouldn't have to try to translate. So we'll go to another round of questions now. Perhaps we'll take 3 this time. So lady at the front here, and then the gentleman in the jacket and tie, and then the gentleman at the back on that side.
My question is regarding big global international aid institutions. And I just wanted to know how much you see loans from the IMF with conditions attached. Do you see that hinders or encourages development and economic growth? And how do you see that influencing future development in the poorest countries in the world?
Okay, then the second question, gentleman over there.
So thank you to the speakers. They were all excellent presentations. My question is specifically related to the African scenario. Africa is starting to become associated with the ability to leapfrog technological development. So in specific industries like telecommunications, we see the ability to, as in many countries that develop landlines and then only reached the point of Wi-Fi based mobile telecommunications. Africa started immediately with Wi-Fi mobile telecommunications and skipped through the whole process of building landlines and using what is now considered archaic technology. Since you were talking about finance and loans, which is my area, do you think that with the advent and development due to the institutional problems of modern internet-based finance systems and with the whole expectations of the blockchain technology, do you think that maybe traditional banking will be skipped all over and we'll see Africa as the hub of a new internet-based finance? Or do you think that in terms of financial products, it's inherently inevitable that traditional banking will overcome? So do you think it will grow and it will start to be a new thing, replacing traditional banking? Or do you think it's just a gateway and paving the way to traditional banking because there is no other alternative? Thank you.
Okay, and then the third question at the back on this side.
Thank you very much. I suppose my question is, would you see the developing and the developed world better served if we had, instead of a national aid budget, a national investment budget that could be used in developing world?
Okay, so 3 very different questions there. So the first question was something really, if it hadn't come up, I'd be quite interested in asking as well, which is the role of the major international institutions. So I guess the IMF, the World Bank, and probably some of the major NGOs you consider these big players as well. So who'd like to sort of comment on whether you think that the sort of loans and conditionality that comes from some of these institutions is actually now a net positive or hindrance to development in these countries? Perhaps Philip, we'll start with you.
Yeah, let's just put aside for a moment the issue of whether or not aid is useful for development completely and just consider the issue of conditionality. I think the general view of people who are both anti-aid and pro-aid is that aid tied to conditions is not really effective. Those who tend to be pro-aid tend to be more on the left and don't like the conditions, and those who are sort of anti-aid tend to be a bit more free markets. Just sort of, I think, appreciate that the conditions actually distort the institutional environment in which aid is going, and it's simply like pushing water uphill. No, you can't, from outside, we saw it in a rather different context with the US intervention in Iraq, kind of just go somewhere and through a bureaucratic process, whether it be tied to money or not, just change the institutions either overnight or over a period of time within a given country. So conditional aid on the whole has not been, is not well regarded. Now, there might be some specific situations where conditions are appropriate, and in particular IMF aid, which is often general budget aid, with the condition being attached that the country gets its fiscal house in order. I think that's perfectly reasonable and is a process which is actually also quite easy to assess. But when you start applying lots of general conditions about institutional reform to aid, what tends to happen is that the government spends all its time essentially reapplying for the same aid over and over again and producing dossiers on whether the conditions were met, if not why, the fact that it wasn't the government's fault and all the rest of it. And you just simply generate more and more bureaucracy. That really has been the record in general of conditional aid.
And on that second question, just staying with you for a minute, Philip. On the general approach to aid, do you agree with the gentleman at the back who said it would actually be better if we almost didn't have an aid budget, we instead had a sort of investment budget, I guess, at a state level? Or do you see the role of aid as being primarily humanitarian when we do have it, and actually you shouldn't get involved, the state shouldn't be involved with those sorts of investments?
No, I think investment aid actually on the whole has proven to be the worst form of aid because this is, if you like, the West trying to do development to other countries. It often ends up encouraging, if the West itself is not trying to guide economic activity in a particular way through investment aid, it encourages the recipient governments to guide economic activity in a particular way to receive that aid. And you've seen over decades now this type of investment aid really being a complete failure because it causes government to distort economic activity. It puts in the hands of government what really should be in the hands of businesses and entrepreneurs in trying to predict what actually, what a country should specialize in, what industries it should develop, and so on. So I would see aid, the least damaging and potentially most useful form of aid on the whole is humanitarian aid, in my view, which should be tied to specific projects, if you like, analysed in advance, firstly for their potential cost effectiveness, and secondly, and perhaps most importantly, for the risks that are attached to those projects. So vaccination projects, primary education projects probably potentially do much less damage than generalised support to governments. I mean, 40% of all arms in Africa in the 1980s were financed through aid. That's a fairly damning indictment, I think, on that type of aid, which isn't related to very particular humanitarian projects.
Yeah, and Christian, just picking up on this question of aid, how do you see the aid debate in terms of its interaction with the entrepreneurialism and some of the case studies that you've done? Is there any evidence that actually aid has been effective in enhancing entrepreneurialism in any way in Africa?
I mean, when I look at NGOs, the main thing I see that they're great jobs, I talk to friends in Kenya, greatest jobs in the country typically are for the big NGOs. Now, I'm not sure if that's the intention of the NGOs, but it is a benefit nonetheless for those who live there that they can actually get fantastic jobs working for one of the big international institutions or for a big NGO. I haven't seen much evidence of aid and entrepreneurism sort of working well and close together, I think. Here, at least these entrepreneurs I talk to who tend to be on the smaller side, they're far removed from an aid budget, They don't get any money from there typically.
Yeah. And
if I could just say, another problem of that type of aid is that it directs entrepreneurial interest and activity upwards from entrepreneurs towards government rather than downwards towards markets and towards people. And if you start off with dysfunctional institutions, that's a pretty good way to keep them dysfunctional.
And I think that's one of the most important things to ask when we're thinking about both the entrepreneurial and the humanitarian aspects is the crowding out problem, right? That many of the functions that are assumed by the international NGOs are functions that could otherwise be done through private charity or through entrepreneurship. And I just, as one case study, there's a charity that I do a lot of work with called World Bicycle Relief, and they are active here. So if you're a cyclist, World Bicycle Relief. And what World Bicycle Relief does is they've purpose-built these very sturdy bikes, and they go into rural communities. They're mostly in Zambia and a few other countries, but they started in Zambia. And what they do is they go and they actually work on the ground in the communities with schoolgirls and home health caregivers. And schoolgirls in particular, if they're having to walk an hour and a half, 2 hours each way to and from school, and the closer they get to being of an eligible age to be in the marriage market, then the likelihood they actually finish their education is really low. And so what this charity does is it goes in and it works with people in those communities and works with the schoolgirls, and they build a bond of trust and basically sign a contract that if you get one of these bikes, then you'll finish your schooling. And the bike makes the schoolgirl an actual asset to her family because she can now carry very heavy things, and it reduces the transaction costs of her getting to and from school. And all of that it's all private, very private charity, and has a lot of humanitarian impacts, but it also raises the productivity of schoolgirls and home health caregivers, which is their focus. Those are the kinds of activities that get crowded out by a lot of the big international aid, sadly.
And the other question that struck me as very, very important, which was about technological leaps in certain areas, and the particular focus that the gentleman focused on was on banking. So I think if I'm going to paraphrase the question, so just to make sure that I understand it in my head, I think the argument that he was making was to ask whether you believe that actually the use of mobile internet-based banking systems, perhaps cryptocurrencies and things, were just a way of getting around, given that traditional banking sectors don't exist, and if the preconditions existed for them to flourish, they'd be there, or whether we're just seeing a complete leap in developing countries, and actually they're getting to a new model of banking, which we're all moved towards to eventually, but they're doing it quicker because the roadblocks to traditional finance are there. What do you, Christian?
It depends on what type of products you talk about here very much, yeah. I had a conversation with the country chairman of Citi for Cameroon. He's one of my students in the exec MBA, and he said they're not worried, yeah. The sort of commercial products that they put together for larger corporations, this is not something that will, at least in the foreseeable future, happen through some internet-based banking or so. The story is very different. I did a talk at the World Council of, what are they called? This community banking, yeah, and these smaller banking companies in developing worlds, particularly in Africa, they're certainly worried about these offers that M-Pesa is putting out there, because that is a product then that is more easily accessible for consumers rather than having to register for a bank where you typically need to have a formal job. Lots of people working in the formal economy, so they don't get access. Now they certainly are under some threat, where you could see that maybe in Africa earlier than here, that these institutions will be vulnerable to competition from places like M-Pesa. I mean, M-Pesa also has a connection to a bank, but it's a small bank just really giving them access to the license, and it's the mobile phone company that runs the show. So certainly that's a threat for them.
Philip and Lynne, any comments on the banking debate?
No further comments now.
Okay, well, we'll go to another round of questions then. So we've got the lady at the back over there, guy at the front here, and perhaps we'll stick here and have then the lady next to him as well. Cut down on shoe leather costs for our roving mics. So the guy at the back to start off. Lady at the back, sorry.
There's been quite a lot of talk about the fact that a lot of countries in Africa have bad institutions, and that's a key problem for economic growth and entrepreneurship and all sorts of businesses. But the question is, how and will these countries move to institutions that are good? So I guess to use the terminology that you're probably familiar with, Acemoglu and Robinson, who use they talk about inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. And you do see cases like Asia is a really good example, where you have countries that have quite extractive institutions but quite high economic growth and entrepreneurship. So I guess the question is Africa going to change, and are the institutions going to become more inclusive, and how? Or is it not going to happen and are they going to grow anyway?
Okay, and then gentleman at the front.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's actually quite a similar question to the one just there. More generally, I think Booth, you said that like within 200 years, Africa would be the main, could be the biggest continent. I was just looking at it in a more shorter term in the next few decades, how, I guess, how you guys envisage Africa changing and whether they would become more influential in terms of, I don't know, general political economy, geopolitics, etc., or, as has just been kind of asked, these institutions may just hinder that, and it's only until the institutions change till Africa can really grow. So basically your opinions on that. Thank you.
My question was more about whether, to do with the aid question, whether our emphasis should be on us giving aid or perhaps making the world market a bit more equitable. So particularly with, I think, the EU agricultural policy, for example, whether the question should be giving money to Africa while also giving money to EU farmers and kind of distorting the market in that way, or whether it should be more about focusing on what we're doing to make it less fair and then allowing them to develop in their own way.
Okay, so I think the first two questions were related and were really about this institutional approach. So if you look at countries on a cross-sectional basis, it's quite easy, as Philip sort of outlined, to identify what the preconditions for successful economy, prosperous economies are. But how does that interact? How does that work dynamically? Is it that some African countries, for whatever reason, due to resource curses or whatever, are sort of condemned to having bad institutions? And perhaps how can you overcome those bad institutions? How do you reverse institutional failure of that kind? Anybody got any sort of opening thoughts on that question?
My first thought would be a lot of it changed already. Yeah, it's really not quite as bad anymore. When you compare many of the African economies to India or China, where we hear less of that, yeah, it's in anything, it's worse probably in India and China, corruption, than it is actually in many African countries. It's just that we have this picture that things are so bad, and they really are not. Yeah, the halls of these government offices nowadays, they are flocked with Western graduates. We have a growing middle class who is more demanding, and this does change things over time. Yeah? It's not all great, but it's much better than we typically think.
So, Philip, just on that point, this sort of seems to be a sort of chicken and egg situation. Is it that good institutions lead to economic growth, or can the economic growth and the rise of a middle class that Christian was just mentioning lead to better institutions, or are they sort of just a self-reinforcing mechanism?
Okay, I mean, first of all, we often talk about this problem in the context of Africa, but as I mentioned before, a large proportion of the world's poor, if not the majority, probably live in one or two large South American countries, plus India. And a lot of the problems I talked about are probably greater in their extent and the difficulties they cause in India than they are in most African countries. And what has happened, I suppose, in the last 20 years, even over a shorter time scale perhaps, is that we can really stop talking about Africa, or at least sub-Saharan Africa, as one big lump. You know, many countries, not just Botswana in Africa, have developed, and it's not true that the whole continent is any more ridden with warfare. I think just 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer, but about 10 years ago, there were 14 different major civil conflicts in Africa. Now there are 7 or even fewer. That's a big change. So I think instead of just talking about Africa, we should be talking about poor institutions wherever they exist, and that might be Venezuela, some African countries, Nigeria being an obvious example, which is often in the news, India and China, especially some parts of China. Now, wherever these bad institutions exist, how do you get change? I think that's something we don't really know much about in advance, and perhaps we can't even bring about. Certainly, from the West, we may be able to do things which harm the process and some things which encourage the process. But we are talking, if you're talking about a war which leads to the expropriation of large numbers of people, you're talking about something which is very difficult to control from outside, and maybe if you're somebody of goodwill, somebody who just wants to get on with their business, a peaceful, peace-loving person, it may be very difficult for you to prevent a powerful minority from wreaking havoc within your own country, as we see in a number of Middle Eastern countries at the moment. So I think it's just very difficult to predict these things. In relation to chicken and egg, no, we've seen lots of countries which have developed in the past, which have then gone backwards. One thinks of several South American examples, and some that will happen to some African countries too. So neither development nor retardation is an inevitable process. It depends, I think, on human nature and events which are really very much outside our control. Do you want me to deal with the trade and aid question or another? Do you want to deal with this question first and then come back to that one?
If you're...
Okay.
We're finished on this question first, then we'll do the trade and aid in a round.
And since Philip mentioned Nigeria, I mean, within thinking about the kind of resource curse question and how that relates, is Nigeria is a good example of this. It also brings back in the kind of China as a big player thing, because what's going on in world energy markets, especially in world oil markets, will be and natural gas, will be very interesting to see how that changes the power dynamic. Because, and again, it's a technological innovation story, and that a lot of the hydraulic fracturing and the horizontal drilling technologies that we've really applied in the US have increased the domestic supply of oil and natural gas in the US and have really reduced the need for US imports from the Middle East and Africa of oil. And that is changing the geopolitical dynamic of these resource curse-based economies and the extractive political institutions that sit on top of them and literally siphon them out. And I think that will be an interesting thing to see, is as that market becomes more global and less concentrated, will Nigeria really still be able to have those extractive institutions sit on top of that oil supply when that oil supply is not that big a deal in the world market anymore? And similarly, I mean, I would make the same kind of argument for China as a big player, because some of what I think the Chinese companies have come in and done in Africa is in energy industries, right? And so that innovation that has gone on with fracking and horizontal drilling that has increased the supply outside of these countries will undermine some of that power, some of that concentrated power as well.
And you make a good point about Nigeria. I go there regularly. In a couple of weeks, actually, I'll be down there again. And it depends on where you are in Nigeria, also how big corruption is a problem. Lagos State, where you have a lot of commerce, and where the local government started to take more active interest in collecting tax, and that is starting to become a major factor in getting things done in that state. You see less of a corruption problem than in some of the other states.
And I mean, we're seeing this in the U.S. right now with the legalization of marijuana. Is exactly that same dynamic.
I think culture is important as well, and the longer you have good institutions in a country, if you get disruption, the easier I think it is to go back to having good institutions. And I think the fall of the Berlin Wall demonstrated that the experience of Poland has been much better than the experience of some parts of the Soviet Union, where they'd never really had a market economy based upon private property rights, freedom of contract, and so on. And it's because culture is important that a number of think tanks globally actually try to work in developing countries to try to promote understanding of how free markets work. And it's just very important that people in general realize that social and economic cooperation is a way to prosperity, rather than taking something that belongs to somebody else through the apparatus of the state infrastructure.
The final question from the front was about the trade versus aid debate, and I suspect that I know what all of your answers to this question will be, so I'll put another sort of rider on it. How significant now, relative to all these other problems that we've talked about, and it's important not to be too pessimistic, but relative to these other problems, how much of a problem do you think is the non-liberalisation of trade is for developing countries?
Well, shall I go first? Right. First of all, we should separate them out. We should stop having trade versus aid discussions, I think. They are two distinct issues. You can believe in protectionism and not believe in aid. You can believe in free trade and believe in aid, and the other two combinations are perfectly rational and logical too. Free trade would help underdeveloped countries, but perhaps not as much as is often thought. India is itself, potentially, if they remove internal barriers, it's 1/6 of the world's population. It is a huge internal market. If we prevent, as a result of trade barriers, the importation of certain things from India, they can do other things. So whilst trade, I think, is important at the margins, I don't think it's hugely important. But again, coming back to this big player issue, it can be, trade restrictions can be very disruptive. The US, I think it's much worse in the US than actually it is in the EU. So US trade restrictions can have the potential to sort of wipe out large swathes of the West African cotton industry and rice production in some countries as well. But we should promote free trade because free trade is better not just for developing countries but also for developed countries. Free trade would benefit us actually much more than it would benefit developing countries. But it is a separate question really from aid, which I think should be considered separately.
And perhaps we'd get further with it if we, given that people are driven by self-interest, if we highlighted the benefits to us as well. I know that we'd all be quite keen on importing cheap Argentinian and Chilean steak, for example. But perhaps let's go for another round of...
I have one quick add-on, because you asked specifically about the subsidies to farmers in Europe, Now, it would be great for Africa to scrap them, Is it going to happen? Never, Absolutely never. When I was your age, I did an internship once in the Conservative Party in my state, in Tyrol, in Austria. 2/3 of the members of the Conservative Party are members from the Farmers Association. Do you think that's going to change agricultural policies? Probably not, It's a very influential group, the Farmers Lobby, I think, and they have certainly no interest in scrapping the subsidies.
And you're seeing that even in the US debate, aren't you? In the primary debate around ethanol subsidies as well. Another round of questions then. We've got still a fair bit of time. So, lady there. And then here. And then, I can't see it, it's in darkness over there. Then there's a person in the white shirt there. All I can see is shadow and a white t-shirt.
It's a question to all the staff panel members. This time, I would like to target a different part of the world, more specifically Eastern Europe. So, from what you've heard about Eastern Europe and from your knowledge about this part of the world, do you think that there could be a significant lack of property rights and legal enforcement with regards to the post-communist countries and Greece? And if you think so, what would be the best ways to enforce those rules? Should it be towards, with the help of education, certain activities, interaction with other parts of the world, or should it be with channels from the government, from the local authorities? And can this additionally promote growth of the European Union, like economic growth and sustainability?
Sorry, the mic is very echoey this time for some reason. So let me just, so I understand the question. It's about the enforcement of property rights in the European Union in countries like Greece.
Yes, in Greece and post-communist countries.
Right.
And Central and Eastern Europe countries which are not in the European Union as well. Was that part of it? Oh, no. Okay,
excuse me, it's my bad. Post-communist countries which are in the European Union.
Okay.
Yes, such as Romania,
Yeah.
Bulgaria.
Okay.
Yeah. Slovakia.
Okay. Thank you. Second question here.
Yeah, a little embarrassing one. How necessary do you think political reforms are to cope with some serious economic problems in such countries like Zimbabwe? Thank you very much.
Okay, and third question?
Hello. I was just wondering why nobody talks about population control anymore. If you look at a 15-year-old in this country, by the time she's 30, she might have had 2 children. By the time she's 60, she might have 4 grandchildren. Compare that with a 15-year-old in Indonesia who, by the time she's 30, might have had 9 children, and then by the time she's 60, hundreds of grandchildren. Why does nobody talk about poverty being caused by overpopulation anymore?
Okay, so perhaps we'll go in reverse order on these ones and start with the sort of Malthusian population argument. So Lynne, over to you.
One of the interesting things about the kind of population control and how that analysis has changed over the past 3 decades, I should say, full disclosure, I'm trained as an economic historian, so this is now in my bailiwick. One of the things that we learn when we look at the history of economic growth and the history of living standards over the past 300 years was that in the 19th century, in particular in Britain first, and then the US, and then continental Europe, that we had what we call the demographic transition. And so in the sort of mid to late 19th century, birth rates started falling. And this was a surprising effect because, the kind of received wisdom was the Malthusian wisdom that what do people do when their incomes and their living standards go up? They have more children. And so they procreate away whatever surplus they've managed to generate through enhanced productivity, whatever. And in the late 19th century, that reversed. And that the industrialized countries started having smaller and smaller and smaller birth rates. And this has become a fairly robust pattern, and that we see as living standards increase and economic growth occurs in different countries, birth rates, you sort of hit a tipping point and then birth rates fall. And so a lot of the conversation within kind of the economic growth aspects, and in particular in my case, because I teach a lot and engage in a lot of sort of discussions about the environmental aspects of this, is a lot of the argument seems to be focusing on productivity, focusing on economic growth, focusing on enabling creativity and ingenuity so that innovation happens and that living standards rise in poor countries, and that will trigger a demographic transition and reduce birth rates, because that's the pattern that we've seen in other countries.
Yeah, so it's really an empirical analysis which shows actually birth rates tend to decline after wealth and prosperity increase, rather than population growth depressing prosperity in the first place. So, Christian, any comments on that?
Well, if you go back to my talk, what this historian in Innsbruck found is that actually before you have stronger development, it's a positive effect when you have population growth, because then that means more people flock to cities, you have more urbanization, you have division of labor, you have development, and then you'll have the second effect kicking in after that.
Yeah, it's almost one of the last vestiges of imperialism, I think, the way in which we talk about population control in poor countries. Poor families have large numbers of children for pretty good reasons, and if you don't have a sophisticated capital markets and sophisticated social protection systems, then it's a good idea to procreate more in order to that you have more children who can then go out to work, look after you when you're old. Many of the children will die when they're young, and so on. And I think perhaps we should be looking more at our own developed countries plus China, that when you look at the combination of the social security systems we have based on taxing working generations to pay pensions with populations which in some cases are just going to fall off a cliff. We really have never been here before, and the dangers of that are going to be absolutely enormous, whereas the dangers of large populations are actually really not that great because, as Lynne said, they tend to be organically manageable, that as people become prosperous, they have fewer children.
Okay, and we'll have to wrap the final two questions into one because we're running out of time. So very brief answers on this one. So how important relative to these other things would the sort of necessary political reforms in countries like Zimbabwe be? And on that sort of a similar point, what lessons from the sort of analysis that we've heard from all three of you today could equally be applied, and how could they be applied to countries perhaps who are a bit more developed, like Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria within the European Union? Are there any transferable lessons from what we've been talking about up here today? So who'd like to kick off on that?
Well, okay, so you want us to wrap together Zimbabwe and Greece, basically?
Well, if they leave the euro and have a large devaluation, then there might be some similarities.
Let me focus a bit more on the European Union, because I think this is a really important question. I'm not as Eurosceptic as some of my colleagues at the IEA, and I take Richard Epstein's view that there's a huge difference between getting basic things right. Takes countries from a poverty to a pretty reasonable level of development. We can then have discussions about whether it's better to be in Sweden or the United Kingdom, but these are marginal compared with the great benefits that you get from getting institutions right and having an entrepreneurial business economy. And what's the role of the EU here? Well, the EU does an awful lot of things, and in its core purpose, you have the freedom of movement of capital, labour, free trade, all the rest of it. In the European Convention on Human Rights, you have all sorts of rights to property and so on enshrined in this. Yeah, I think the EU ought to be doing rather more in this field. It certainly causes improvement amongst potential members in the time when they're preparing to join, because countries like Romania and Croatia have been desperate to join. But then what happens after they join, I think, is a very fair question to ask. It does take time, but when you think how rapidly a country like Slovenia or Croatia or Poland or Estonia managed to create the conditions which were necessary, meet the conditions which it was required to meet to join the European Union, that was a remarkable transformation which I think demonstrates it could be done. And they really wanted to join the European Union, and they did change in order to do that. And perhaps the EU should accept that actually as a big achievement and learn lessons from it, and in terms of its relationship with those countries within the European Union, but also on the demands it imposes on countries before they join.
Any final comments?
Successes.
And I think this is true for both of these questions, and it's maybe an odd comment coming from an economist, but I really think, and this is one of the areas where big international aid has had real pitfalls, is that we should really, I think, focus on concentrations of political power. And that should be, that's the real problem, is when you have concentrations of political power. And that big international aid has been, okay, well, let's work with the dictator and make the dictator do good things. And I think the right answer is, the diffusion of political power, but that has to happen in an organic way. And that's challenging and takes a lot of time.
And Christian, any upbeat messages in 10 seconds before we finish?
Okay, final kind of gist here, which wraps these opportunities that I see in Africa and links a little bit to some of the things you were saying on electricity supply. A cool little story, so to speak, to go out here, which highlights that the very successful entrepreneurial activities often take technology and put some real need that people have in Africa together. So electricity access, as you were pointing out, is a tough one in many rural areas in Africa as well. And this is a new solution, so to speak, on the market in Kenya. It's called M-Kopa. Now, M-Kopa, what they do is they provide you with a solar panel, but now the typical problem for getting a solar panel for you as an individual out there in the rural areas, you don't have enough money to pay for a solar panel. And they solve that problem for you, You remember there's M-Pesa, which allows you to make make mobile payments. Now M-Copper has a little box which is connected to the solar panel. They put a SIM card inside, and you can pay on a daily basis whatever, I can't remember, I think it's 40 shillings or so, yeah, that you pay for a day's supply of electricity, which you then get after you kind of uploaded your credits using M-Pesa. And once you've paid off the worth of the device, the whole thing runs for free for you, yeah. It's a new activity, very cool, and it combines technology with something that is very much needed by people, and it's taking off at the moment. And a friend of mine works there.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing more about it. So, in 90 minutes, we've spoken on this panel about aid, Bitcoin, Impenza, Greece, Thomas Malthus, EU agricultural policy, networks and networks of things, and the IMF. I think we've covered a lot of ground in 90 minutes. So, Philip, Lynne, Christian, thank you so much. Could you thank them in the usual way?